part two of assembling evidence. Today we're going to talk a little bit about how to best to organize the evidence that you've been gathering over the past 2 or 3 weeks. I first want to talk to you about identifying stakeholders and how you represent that in your memo. You first want to provide a brief summary of the key stakeholders. And what I mean by that, some of the problems that you all may be looking at may have 20 stakeholder groups, and it can get overwhelming. So I want you to focus on those folks who tend to have the most influence on the outcomes. And so that means anywhere from 3 to 5 stakeholders. Don't go beyond that. You have very limited space in the problem statement to introduce these characters into the memo. Now you want, in that summary, you want to consider the full spectrum of the power dynamic, which means that you should think about those who are impacted by the problem as being stakeholders. I know in some analysis that's not the case, but in this particular memo, you should consider them. But also consider the folks that are pushing the buttons or making the decisions, so the decision makers. Have a nice mix and don't just focus on all decision makers, but think about the full power dynamic and try to maybe fit the 3 characters from the most power, medium range, and the folks with the least power. You also want to identify each stakeholder's relationship to the problem. Did the stakeholder create the problem? How are they impacted by the problem? And lastly, you want to identify the stakeholders who could help usher some of the change that you see as possible in your analysis, or are they there to perpetuate injustice, right? So identify these stakeholders with these 3 bullets, and that if you focus on that, I think it will allow you to write your stakeholder summary fairly quickly and be brief and succinct. I also want to talk to you a little bit about how you organize this stakeholder conversation, or in essence, the people that are involved, the key players. Now, common tools that are used in policy analysis would be an environmental scan, which I'll show you what that might look like visually, or the SWOT or SOAR analysis. Now, SOAR is a update to SWOT. So most people know SWOT, so I'll talk a little bit about both. But first, the environmental scan. Now, environmental scans are appropriate when you're trying to understand the grand scheme of things. That means, who are all of the parties involved and how do they interact with each other and what are they contributing to the problem, or how are they contributing to solving the problem? It tends to be very stakeholder oriented. You really can't do an environmental scan if you haven't identified the stakeholders involved with the problem. Now, the SWOT analysis, it tends to be appropriate for analyzing the problem from within. And what I mean by that is if you selected a particular problem that is perpetuated, let's say, by the correction branch of criminal justice. But more particular, you're looking at Rikers Island as being a particular issue within Rikers. And so here, you would probably want to use a SWOT analysis versus environmental scan, or a combination of the two. And you'll see why here in a moment. Now, SWOT and SOAR tend to be depicted in 2x2 tables, but you'll also in your report want to summarize that table. So not just present the table, but summarize what the reader is seeing in the table. Both of these approaches, SWOT and SOAR, include a short list of strengths. What's different here is that SWOT tends to outline the weaknesses, where SOAR tends to be more aspirational and looking ahead. So let's take a look at what these tools look like visually. So the environmental scan. Now, in this example, you wouldn't put stakeholder number 1. This would be, you would insert the name of the stakeholder that you're interested in or that you've identified through your literature review. And then stakeholder 2, 3, 4, 5. Again, you don't have to go up to 5. I think 3 is sound. But you'll want to look at these elements, and for each, and I do want you to look at the slide deck after you've listened to this mini lecture, because you'll find in the notes of each slide additional supplemental learning that I think will give you more context beyond these mini lectures. But you'll want to see, what's the proximity to the problem? What are the means in which the stakeholder is using to engage? And then how essential are they? So that could be a ranking. But again, watch the supplemental learning. There's flexibility as to how you use this matrix. There's no right or wrong way to do it, but there are key angles in which you should approach each of these sort of subcategories here. Or each category. They're not really subcategories. And now, SWOT analysis. I won't cover SOAR because it's very similar. You're creating a list, basically. But it's a dialogue between the members of the group as to what each of you think the strengths and weaknesses are for the 3 potential policy options that you've identified from the literature. Now, let's just imagine that this is policy number 1. And in elementary school, we created pros and cons lists. And that's pretty much what SWOT is. It's a pros and cons list on steroids because it adds the opportunities and the threats to the pros and cons list that we're used to making. So you would do a SWOT analysis for each of the options that you're entertaining or that you think might be a viable solution to the problem. The SWOT analysis sometimes can be more engaging, and it may illuminate things that you may have not noticed if you did an environmental scan and you're only talking about the characters involved. The policy analysis is definitely more effective when you can combine the environmental scan with a SWOT analysis. But again, you have to take into consideration, are you looking at problems within an organization or are you looking at legislation? If you're looking at legislation, sticking with an environmental scan alone should be fine. But if you're looking at problems within a specific unit within criminal justice, then you may want to look at SWOT analysis and or combine it with an environmental scan. Just want to give you a few more additional tips for your paper and follow up with any questions. Send me emails if you have any. Use one of the 3 tools to organize your evidence. So as you're collecting evidence, you may still be in the evidence collection process. I'm not sure where you all are at this point. I'll find out after looking at your progress reports. But include the summary of the matrix or scans or SWOT analysis that you do in the body of the report in the problem statement section. But the chart itself, move that to the appendix. Any visuals that you have for this report, you'll want to put them in the appendix. Your group should also decide on the appropriate tool. So review this lecture, obviously, and have a discussion at the end as to which of these tools that you think are most appropriate. Now, if you come across a tool and you're scouring the internet that are more appropriate and to help you organize the data, information, and evidence that you've gathered, bring it to my attention. I'll probably tell you to use it, So if you feel strongly about a tool that's not represented here in this mini lecture, run it by me. I'm open to it, and we'll help you move your project forward. Now, the last thing is make sure there's attention to detail. So analyze your evidence with the end goal of identifying roadblocks and opportunities. So as you're reading journal articles or you're looking at what one state did versus another state or city, think about roadblocks, right? And think about opportunities like, hey, this might be a great solution for the problem that we're looking at. So I want you to be a conscious evidence collector. And more importantly, you're going to come across a lot of information. I need you to be willing to cut the fat. So get rid of extraneous evidence. Even if it looks like sophisticated data, divorce yourself of it. You only have 7 to 10 pages to write this memo. If you have any questions, again, follow up with me via email.